1 in 4, not 1 in 1,000. Not a rare medieval pathology that applied to cloistered monks in the 14th century. 1 in 4 adults. That is the estimate Father Chad Ripperger published, a trained theologian, a clinical psychologist, a man who has spent decades at the intersection of psychiatry and exorcism ministry. 1 in 4 people sitting in your parish next Sunday morning. The person in the pew to your left, the person in the pew to your right, possibly the person reading these words right now. And the frightening part is not the number. The frightening part is what Ripperger said immediately after it. Most of them will never know. My name is Raymond. I taught Catholic high school religion for 35 years in Covington, Kentucky. I retired from a classroom where I watched young people struggle with their minds in ways that the textbooks never fully explained to me. After my wife Margaret passed, 3 years ago now, I had a great deal of time to read things I had been meaning to read for years. One of those things was Padre Pio's actual correspondence, not the popular biographies, the letters. And separately, after attending Father Ripperger's lecture in Cincinnati in 2018, I began reading his clinical theological framework for what he calls diabolical obsession. What I found in those two bodies of work together, the letters of a stigmatized Capuchin friar and the clinical taxonomy of a modern exorcist psychologist, was something I wish I had understood 30 years earlier. Because I watched students suffer in silence for 3 decades, and I gave them the wrong map. This video is the map I should have had. Let me start with a question most Catholics never ask aloud. Have you ever had a thought arrive in your mind that you did not send? Not a daydream, not a distraction. A thought, sometimes dark, sometimes accusatory, sometimes simply wrong, that appeared with no apparent origin and refused to leave. Have you ever felt a weight of despair that had no object? Not grief. Grief has a reason. Not anxiety. Anxiety at least tracks a recognizable threat. Just despair. Heavy. Sourceless. Have you ever woken at the same time on multiple consecutive nights? Not from a sound, not from physical discomfort, with your mind already engaged in a familiar, exhausting loop? Have you ever been in a moment of genuine peace, at Mass, in prayer, in a rare quiet hour, and felt something collapse inside you without cause? And then have you told yourself, this is just the way my mind works? Or, I've always been like this. Or there's probably something chemically off. I should talk to someone. These are not rhetorical questions. I am asking because these are the precise diagnostic markers Ripperger associates with what Catholic theology has called obsessio diabolica, diabolical obsession. And 1 in 4 of you reading this has some degree of it. Let me be careful here because this is where precision matters. Ripperger is not saying that anxiety is demonic. He is not saying that depression is demonic. He is not dismissing clinical psychology or neuroscience. He is saying something more specific, and if you follow it carefully, more alarming. He distinguishes 6 stages of diabolical influence over a human person. The first stage is temptation, which is universal and morally neutral, the ordinary condition of being human in a fallen world. The second is infestation, the demonic presence manifesting in external locations, objects, or events, rather than directly in the person's mind. The third stage is obsession. Obsession, in Ripperger's taxonomy, is the first stage at which the demonic gains access to the interior life, not to the will, not to the soul in its deepest orientation, but to the flow of thoughts and the emotional field. The person remains fully themselves. They retain free will. They can resist. They can pray. They can receive the sacraments. But their interior monologue has been partially invaded. And here is what makes obsession so difficult to identify. The demon does not arrive with a foreign voice. It does not speak in Latin or announce itself. It speaks in your own interior voice. The accusations sound like your own self-assessment. The despair sounds like your own emotional response to your own life. The intrusive thoughts feel like they originated inside you because the mechanism delivering them has learned precisely and intimately the frequency of your own cognition. This is what Padre Pio described in his letters to his spiritual director, Frater Benedetto Nardella, letters written between 1910 and 1914, during a period when Padre Pio was enduring what he called a war of the mind. He wrote that the demonic interference he was experiencing was, in his own words, more terrifying than the physical assaults. The physical attacks, the documented ones with witnesses that left him bruised and bleeding, those he could endure. But the interior warfare, the assault on his thoughts, his correspondence, his capacity to maintain spiritual connection with his director, that, he wrote, was the true battleground. He specifically described the way the enemy worked to disrupt his written correspondence with Frater Benedetto, not through external interference, but by attacking his capacity to compose thought, to complete a sentence, to send what he had written. He understood this as a targeted strategy. The demon was trying to isolate him from his spiritual guide, because spiritual direction was a weapon the demon could not penetrate. He wrote this in 1911. The clinical description Ripperger published in his work on diabolical obsession in the 21st century matches Padre Pio's personal experience with a precision that should give us pause. Now let me give you the clinical distinction that changes everything. When a mental health professional evaluates a patient for anxiety or depression, one of the standard diagnostic questions concerns triggers. What triggers the onset of symptoms? This is the right question for purely neurological or psychological presentations. Anxiety that is entirely biological or psychological tends to track recognizable triggers: stress, conflict, fatigue, relational disruption, caffeine, disrupted sleep. When you can trace the thought pattern to a cause, that is information. When you cannot, when the intrusive thought or the episode of despair simply switches on with no apparent external cause, that is different information. Ripperger draws this distinction explicitly. He does not say that untriggered symptoms are always spiritual in origin. He says that untriggered onset, thoughts or despair that appear to switch on without a recognizable cause, is one of the primary diagnostic markers of obsession as distinct from natural psychological disturbance. The switch. I want you to hold that word. The switch is what Padre Pio was trained to look for in 30 years of hearing confessions, and I will come back to the confessional in a moment. But first, the population numbers. The American Psychological Association reports that 31% of adults in the United States will experience a clinically significant anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. 31%. Ripperger estimates 1 in 4, 25%, of adults experience some degree of diabolical obsession. The overlap between those two numbers is not coincidental. Ripperger is not claiming that every anxiety disorder is demonic in origin. He is asking a question that no secular clinical framework is equipped to answer. Of those 31% with diagnosable anxiety, how many have a spiritual component? Of those who report intrusive thoughts, sourceless despair, and nightmares on a schedule, how many have received a diagnosis that is entirely correct but entirely incomplete? How many people are treating a spiritual wound exclusively with psychological tools? And how many of them are sitting in Catholic parishes every Sunday, receiving communion, going to confession twice a year on Christmas and Easter, and still feeling that something is wrong that nobody can name? This is the question Padre Pio was answering, not in lectures, not in publications, in the confessional. 10 to 19 hours a day. People find that number difficult to process, 10 to 19 hours in the confessional, and they tend to explain it as extraordinary devotion, as the mark of heroic sanctity. Those explanations are not wrong, but they miss the strategic dimension. Witnesses who observed Padre Pio's confessional practice, not devotional biographers, but people who stood outside the confessional door and watched over years, reported something that went beyond devotion. He was conducting something. He would sometimes refuse absolution, not from cruelty, not from harshness, from precision. He would say to certain penitents, "Come back. You must make a full confession. Hold nothing back." And the penitent would return, make a more complete confession, receive absolution, and report that something changed. Not dramatically, not with any visible sign, but something shifted. The thoughts that had been arriving without invitation, the obsessive loops, the accusations, the despair without object, would diminish, sometimes disappear entirely, for a time, and then, in some cases, return. 3 days later, 5 days later, a week. And when they returned to Padre Pio and described this pattern, the relief and then the return, he was not surprised. He recognized what he was looking at, because he had lived it from the other side of the confessional screen. He had written to Factor Benedetto about the relief that followed deep prayer, and then the return of the interior assault. He understood the mechanism. An incomplete confession, in his theological understanding, is not merely a spiritual failing. It is an open legal point of access. The tradition of the Church, going back through Aquinas, through Augustine, through the Desert Fathers, holds that the demonic operates within a framework of permissions. It requires, in a theological sense, some form of legal standing to maintain a sustained interior assault. Unconfessed mortal sin, particularly sin that the penitent deliberately omits, either from shame or from a false belief that it falls outside the ordinary formula, provides that standing. Padre Pio knew this. He was not spending 10 to 19 hours in the confessional because he was performing extraordinary devotion as an end in itself. He was performing spiritual warfare, case by case, door by door, legal point by legal point. This is what witnesses understood when they watched him refuse absolution and send someone back. He was not judging them. He was seeing, with the spiritual perception his director and his order had long recognized as genuine, exactly what was keeping the door open, and he was refusing to seal the absolution before the door was shut. Padre Pio wrote, "The enemy of our souls knows well that meditation is the first step toward virtue. And if you understand what obsession is, the invasion of the interior flow of thought and feeling, then you understand why the enemy would target precisely that doorway. The first step toward virtue is interior silence. The capacity to sit with God in contemplation, the capacity for undistracted prayer. Obsession attacks exactly that threshold. Not the will remains free, not the soul at its deepest level. The soul's fundamental orientation toward God is not touched by obsession, but the quiet, the approach to prayer, the moment before meditation begins, the interior silence from which contemplation is born. That is where the assault concentrates. And that is why Padre Pio wrote, "The enemy knows exactly what he is attacking when he sends an obsessive thought at the precise moment a person kneels to pray. He is not attacking at random. He is attacking the threshold." Now I want to tell you about a student. I taught high school religion in Covington for 35 years. For 23 of those years, I taught at the same school, in the same classroom, with the same view of the same parking lot. One year, this would have been in the early 90s, a quiet junior named Patrick began appearing at my classroom door after school. He was not there for help with an assignment. He was there to ask a question that did not fit on any assignment. He sat down one afternoon and he said, "Mr. Raymond, why do I have thoughts I don't want?" He was 17. He said he had been to 2 therapists. He said the medication helped for a while and then stopped. He said he was going to Mass, he was going to confession regularly, and he still felt, his word, haunted. He did not use the word in a dramatic way. He used it the way you use a word when you cannot find a better one. I gave him what the textbook said: cognitive distortions, brain chemistry, stress management, the language of that decade. He nodded, he thanked me, he left, and I never knew what became of him. 20 years later, 2 years after I attended Ripperger's lecture, 2 years after I started reading Padre Pio's actual letters, I found myself thinking about Patrick. I went looking. I found him in a parish directory in northern Kentucky. I called him. He was 37 years old. He was married. He had children. He was still going to Mass, and he was still struggling with the same thing, still on medication, still attending therapy, off and on, still feeling, as he put it, like something was wrong that nobody could name. He had had periods of relief, sometimes months at a time. He had learned to manage, but the pattern had never resolved. The thoughts that arrived without invitation, the despair without object. The occasional nights of waking at the same hour with his mind already running a familiar, exhausting loop. That phone call changed how I understood 25 years of watching students suffer in silence. Because I realized that Patrick had come to the right room and received the wrong map. He had come to a religion teacher, and I had given him psychology. He needed both. I understand that now. Ripperger himself insists on both. The spiritual and the clinical are not in opposition, but I had given him only half of what he needed, the half that addressed the brain and not the doorway. This video is what I should have had in that classroom. This is what I want to give you now, because if you recognized yourself in Patrick's description, the thoughts without invitation, the despair without object, the relief that comes and then retreats, what I'm about to describe is not a diagnosis. It is a framework, a set of tools, a beginning. Step 1 is a diagnostic exercise. For the next 7 days, I want you to do something simple. When an intrusive thought arrives, a dark thought, an accusatory thought, a thought that does not feel like it belongs to your ordinary mental landscape, I want you to pause and ask one question. Is there a trigger? Can I trace this to something that happened today? A conflict, a stress, physical fatigue, something I consumed, a conversation that left a wound? If the answer is yes, if there is a clear line from cause to thought, that is important information. It points towards psychological territory. If the answer is no, if the thought simply switched on, if you cannot trace it to any recognizable cause, that is also important information. It points toward territory that psychology alone does not fully map. Keep a simple record, 7 days, triggered or not triggered. The pattern will tell you something. Step 2, make a thorough confession. Not the confession you make in 2 minutes on the first Saturday of Advent. Not the habitual, abbreviated formula. A serious, deliberate examination of conscience, going back at least 3 to 5 years, with nothing held back. If there is something you have never said in a confessional because you were ashamed, or because you were not sure it qualified, or because you told yourself it was not that serious, that is the thing to say. The unspoken item is almost always the one that matters. Ask the priest to pray the words of absolution slowly. Do not be in a hurry. Step 3. Within 24 to 48 hours after that confession, observe. You are looking for the switch. Do the intrusive thoughts diminish? Does the sourceless despair lift? Does something in the interior landscape change? This is not a superstition. This is not magical thinking. This is the diagnostic test that Padre Pio was running with thousands of penitents over 30 years of confessional ministry. If the pattern changes after confession, if even temporarily, even partially, the interior noise quiets, that is information. Step 4. If the thoughts return 3 to 7 days later with no recognizable trigger, note the timeline. Then go to a traditional priest, a priest trained in spiritual direction, ideally familiar with Ripperger's framework or with the Thomistic tradition of discernment, and describe what you observed, not as a crisis, not as a demand for an exorcism, as information calmly presented. Tell them I made a complete confession. Within 48 hours, the pattern changed. Within a week, it returned. I am trying to understand what I am dealing with. That conversation is the beginning of proper discernment. Step 5. Add one specific prayer to your evening practice. The Chaplet of St. Michael, the full 9-choir version, not the abbreviated modern form. Padre Pio prayed this chaplet daily. He specifically recommended it for those he recognized as under spiritual pressure. Pay particular attention to the invocation of the 7th choir, the holy princes of the heavenly host, those angelic orders specifically charged with defense against the princes and powers of darkness. This is not decorative language. In the Catholic theological tradition, the hierarchy of angelic warfare maps directly onto the hierarchy of diabolical opposition. The 7th choir addresses the level of spiritual warfare most commonly associated with obsession. Pray it before sleep, not as a formula, as a petition from a specific location with a specific problem to a specific order of beings assigned to that problem. Step 6. Ask your priest to bless salt, ordinary salt, and place a small amount at the threshold of your bedroom before sleep. Padre Pio kept blessed objects on his person and in his cell as ongoing barriers. The tradition of using blessed salt at thresholds is ancient and theologically grounded. This is not folk magic. The blessing is what matters. The specific prayer of exorcism over the salt that the traditional ritual contains. Ask your priest to use the traditional blessing, not the simplified modern form. The distinction, theologically, is significant. Step 7. Pray the prayer against obsession from Father Ripperger's Deliverance Prayers for use by the laity. This is a publicly available text. It contains a binding prayer addressed specifically to any spirit of obsession, false accusation, or sourceless anxiety. It is written for lay use. You do not need a priest present. You do not need special authorization. It is a prayer of petition and binding in the name of Christ, invoking the authority of his passion and resurrection over any spirit that has taken up a position in the interior life without consent. Pray it in the evening. Pray it with specific intention, not in a hurry, not as a formula. As a person who has done a diagnostic exercise and believes, based on the evidence available, that something requires direct address. That specificity matters. It is the difference between a general declaration and a targeted petition. 7 steps. I want to name something directly before I close. If you recognized yourself somewhere in what I described, the thoughts that arrive without invitation, the despair without object, the relief from confession that does not hold, you have likely been telling yourself a story about that experience for years. The story probably involves brain chemistry, or personality, or family history, or the ordinary difficulty of being a person in the modern world. Those stories may be partially true. I am not telling you to abandon medical care. I am not telling you that everything you have attributed to psychology is spiritually caused. I am telling you that the map is incomplete without the spiritual dimension, and that Padre Pio, who spent the equivalent of a full working week inside a confessional, week after week for 50 years, was operating with a complete map. He saw what the spiritual direction of his day called the legal architecture of demonic influence. He understood that unconfessed sin was not merely a moral failure, it was an open door. And he spent 50 years of his priesthood closing doors, one confession at a time. When I think about Patrick now, 37 years old, still struggling, still going to Mass, still feeling that something was wrong that nobody could name, I think about what Padre Pio would have said if Patrick had walked into the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo. I think Padre Pio would have listened. And then he would have said, "Come back. Make a full confession, hold nothing back," not because he was harsh, because he could see the door, and he knew exactly how to close it. If you have been carrying something for years that no one has been able to name, pick one step tonight, just one. The enemy has already had enough days. Tonight that changes.